І на татарську мову це 80.
İskender İbrahim. O Hamilton damat. Bilmem ben Zobacz. Прямо сюди приїхали. Телефона все одно. Мохаммед, салам алейкум. Гості. Я хотів писати. Я Салам алейкум. My wife.
Pleasure seeing you.
No, I need it written out in Tatar language.
This is in Tatar.
That's in Tatar?
Yeah. Well, this is in Tatar, okay? And this is in English.
So welcome to Canada and
welcome.
Everything will be much.
Gentlemen, Pani Panove, I would ask you to please welcome the Honorable Mr. Mustafa Dzhemilev, Chairman of the Parliament of the Crimean Tatar people and Member of Parliament of Ukraine. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to have so many people here today. Quick note, my name is Ivan Baker, and today is truly a special occasion. I will say that as we go forward, I will be speaking in English. I know that we'll have some of the speakers speak partly in English, partly in Ukrainian, and someone should speak mainly in English. And I hope those of you who speak Ukrainian will if I could ask for your patience with that. We have people here who speak either only English or only Ukrainian. We'd like to accommodate everyone if possible. Another language too. Hoping you can translate to me. As I said, it's wonderful to see so many people here today. This is truly a special occasion. Sometimes the most important geopolitical issues, some of the most important human rights issues, don't get the attention they need until it is too late. And today, we'll be talking about some of those issues. Tonight, we'll be talking about the role of Crimea in Eastern Europe, its potential impact, or the degree of impact on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We'll be talking about the plight of the Crimean Tatar people. We'll be talking about the risks of potential conflict in Eastern Europe and other important issues. But today is also a special occasion because today, in addition to discussing these issues, we also have with us someone who is a leader on these issues in Ukraine, who is making an impact on these issues in Ukraine. He's a man who has distinguished himself in his battle for human rights. He is someone who has stood up to the Soviet regime and paid the personal price, spent 15 years in Soviet gulags as a result of his defense of his countrymen. And today, he is the chairman of the Parliament of the Crimean Tatar people, and he is a member of the Parliament of Ukraine. We're very honored to have with us Mr. Mustafa Dzhemilev. I would ask you to welcome him once more. Before getting started, I'd like to welcome a few special guests with us. I know we have leaders from across the community and from many walks of life, and we can't introduce everybody, but there are a couple people I'd like to welcome. I'd like to start by welcoming Mr. Jesse Fliss, former member of Parliament, Parkdale High Park. I'd like to welcome Mr. Mark Fryman, President of the Canadian Jewish Congress. Marika Shkabara, President of the World Congress of Ukrainian Women's Organizations. And we have also with us Sahih Kasinchuk, Executive Member of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress National. Today's event was organized by Mr. Borys Wrzesnewski, Member of Parliament for Etobicoke-Centre. Many of you know him well, very well. And so I will not spend a lot of time introducing him. But I think there are a couple of points that need to be mentioned. Borys Wrzesnewski has been, before being elected to Parliament, was a long-time advocate for human rights and democracy in Ukraine. There are a couple of points I'd like to share. For years, Mr. Wrzesnewski was an activist in the Ruch movement in Ukraine, and over the years engaged in the promotion of democracy and human rights. In fact, Borys Wrzesnewski is thought to be the last Westerner to have been expelled in 1989 from the Soviet Union before its collapse for having organized and given a speech at one of the first major demonstrations in the former Soviet Union. Now, since being elected, Borys has continued to support Ukraine's democratization. In his first year in office, Borys was responsible during the election crisis in Ukraine in 2004 for presenting 2 unanimous motions in the House of Commons in an emergency debate calling for free and fair elections in Ukraine. He was instrumental in securing the Government of Canada's commitment of 500 election observers during that same period. And for his support of democratic development in Ukraine, Borys was presented the Order of Prince Yaroslav the Wise by Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko on his first visit to Canada. So the organization of today's event is something that Borys is also responsible for. And Borys and the Pomoha Ukrainian Foundation, who sponsored today's event, also sponsored Mr. Dzhemilyev's trip to Canada. So, дякую, Borys, for organizing today's event. I'd now like to ask Borys to share his remarks, after which Mr. Dzhemilev will also share some remarks, and we'll have an open discussion and question and answer period. Thank you.
Шановна громадо, dear guests, leaders of various organizations. When the Soviet Union collapsed, in the West, there was a general sort of euphoria. You read articles about the end of history. In fact, a book was written about the end of history. There was an assumption that all those post-Soviet republics would now enter the journey towards democracy, rule of law, and free market states. And there would be difficulties, but it was taken for granted that these would be democratic, rule of law, free market states. Unfortunately, not just generally in the West, but most experts were wrong. And they were wrong for several reasons, but the most important of which was they really didn't know the history of the region. And they didn't understand what weight that history carries in terms of the question of nationalities, and also how that weight of history reflected itself upon the Russian psyche and its culture. And today we see, when you look at international measures, most of the indices, last year they referred to only 4 of the 16 post-Soviet republics as being democratic. 3 Baltic states and Ukraine. Last year. Well, up until the recent past, the 3 Baltic states were fully embraced by the West, integrated into Western institutions. Unfortunately, Ukraine pretty much was left on an island by itself. And circumstances have been changing in Russia and more recently in Ukraine. Russia has shifted from a path towards democracy onto a path of autocracy, Putinism. and neo-imperialism. And perhaps one of the most problematic and dangerous geopolitical fault lines in the Eurasian landmass today is a fault line that runs through Ukraine. And we see it in the results of the elections in Ukraine. It runs through Ukraine, but it lands in Crimea. And if things start going off the rails in Ukraine, odds are it'll start in Crimea. Now, Crimea is unlike any other region of Ukraine. If we take a look at its particularities, its specificities that are different from all the other oblasts, the regions of Ukraine. First of all, it has the Sevastopol Black Sea, Russian Black Sea fleet base, and all of the issues surrounding that base. And then it also has a question of ethnicities that's more complex and difficult than in any other region of Ukraine. It's the one place where the Russian minority predominates, is about 60% of the population. But it's a very different type of Russian minority. Going back to Tsarist times, and especially during Soviet times, most of the Russians in Crimea are the families of sold Red Army officers who retired to Crimea and established themselves. And then you have the indigenous people of Crimea, the Crimean Tatars. And it's a truly tragic history. In 1944, they were deported en masse, approximately 200,000 by Stalin. And in the second half of the 20th century, the history of the Crimean Tatars was one of ethnic cleansing and complete genocide narrowly averted. In many ways, Mr. Dzhemilev's personal history is a reflection of the history of the Crimean Tatars. At 6 months, his family was part of that mass deportation, ethnic cleansing, of approximately 200,000 Crimean Tatars to Central Asia. Approximately 40 to 45% died. And then as a young man, Mr. Dzhemilev took up the cause of the Crimean language, culture, and most importantly, the cause of the right to return to their ancestral homeland. For standing up for those rights, individual and collective, he spent 15 years in the Soviet Gulag. In fact, he wasn't released until he ended up on a list presented to former President Ronald Reagan and prepared by former political prisoner Sakharov to give to Mr. Gorbachev, and asking Mr. Gorbachev as a gesture of goodwill to release 23 individuals from the Soviet prison system. Mr. Dzhemilev was one of those. But once released, he got back to work. And he was instrumental in leading his people in their return to Crimea. Over the last number of years, the Crimean Tatars have suffered many hardships. as they return to their ancestral homeland. But in the last couple of years specifically, there's a new danger. In 2006, I was an electoral observer with the OSCE. I was to observe in Simferopol, but I switched to observe in Sevastopol instead. And a lot of the officials we met with didn't realize that I could understand everything that they said between themselves. And we met many government officials. And I was not only shocked by the racism and chauvinism, but I was unnerved by some of the phraseology that I heard from leading government officials. That what has to be done with the Crimean Tatars is to do what's down under them. They were talking about ethnic cleansing once again. And over the last number of years, every summer I've gone back to Crimea, and I've seen a progressively more dangerous situation developing. Last fall, or late summer, early fall of last year, there were 2 Russian diplomats expelled from Ukraine by the previous presidential administration. It was uncovered that they were providing financing to groups, Russian chauvinist groups in Crimea. And information was leaked out that, in fact, they allegedly had also provided financing for an assassination team. A team that was to eliminate Mr. Dzhemilev. This summer, when I was in Ukraine, I saw billboards along all the major highways in Ukraine where a new political party called Mejlis, new in the sense it hasn't been in existence in Crimea for a long period of time, but it has in other regions, in Transnistria and Moldova. And they had billboards with young, blonde, blue-eyed boys in army fatigues, in their teens, with a single word, patriotism, and the Russian, stylized Russian double-headed eagle in attack mode. The message was clear. When we take a look at where Crimea finds itself, the distance I traveled today from Ottawa back to Toronto, that's the distance from Crimea to Transnistria, the breakaway region of Moldova, which is a black hole in Europe for human trafficking, arms trafficking, drug trafficking. A little further to the east, but pretty much the same distance, is Georgia. It's a region where over and over we've seen conflicts that were incubated by the Kremlin. And then we have this long-suffering indigenous people of Crimea, the Crimean Tatars, just 13% of the population, who survived incredible tragedies in the 20th century that should things go off the rails would be in the eye of the storm. So as Ivan mentioned, I decided that it was critical to raise public awareness in the West of the dangers, the geopolitical dangers, and the specific dangers that the Crimean people face, Crimean Tatar people face. And we had a number of very successful and good meetings with parliamentarians over the last few days in Ottawa, government officials, ambassadors of many countries. In particular, we met both of the speakers, both the Senate and the House of Commons, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Chair of the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee, the critic of Foreign Affairs for the Liberal Party, and critics of various parties. But what was most encouraging occurred yesterday. As you all know, politics of Ottawa these days is pretty divisive. So it's a rare occasion where you see all MPs of all parties come together. Well, yesterday, at the start of QP, I had the honor of introducing Mr. Dzhemilev in the House of Commons. And something quite incredible happened. There was a unanimous standing ovation that greeted Mr. Dzhemilev in the gallery of the House of Commons. So ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor, a pleasure, but I also feel it a duty for all of us to not only welcome someone who's a legendary figure in Ukraine and Soviet history, a legendary figure when it comes to human rights and nationality rights, Mr. Mustafa Dzhemilev, here in Toronto. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, as you know, in Ukraine there are more than 100 nationalities living, but there are only two of those who are indigenous people of Ukraine. One of them are the Ukrainians, and the other are the Crimean Tatars. So tonight I want to speak to you in the language of the second native and indigenous people of Ukraine, in the Crimean Tatar language.
Başka konuda söylemek istedim. Eski Sovyetler zamanında biz insan hakları için görüştüğümüz zaman Ukrayna diasporasının nasıl rolü olduğunu ve ayrıca Kanada'da yaşayan Ukraynalıların ne derecede bizim görüşümüze destek verdiğinden de biz haberdarız. Onun için ilk önce ben sizlere özüm halkım adına temsil ettiğim Kırım Tatar Meclisi adından Ukrayna devletine onun bağımsızlığının kazanmasına destek verdiğiniz için size derin teşekkürlerimi bildirmek istiyorum.
But before I start, I'd like to say the following: that I'm aware that what was the role of Ukrainian diaspora, and specifically of Ukrainian diaspora here in Canada, when under the Soviets you put your pressure on the country to bring the regime down, to get the independence for Ukraine. And I would like to thank you on behalf of the Crimean Tatar people for that.
Ben konuşmamı esas olarak Kırım'la ilgili olacak. Aslında Boris Bey epeyce malumatı verdi. Ben de birkaç şey söylemek istiyorum. Ondan sonra belki bir nasıl sorunlarınız var ise ona memnuniyetle cevap veririm. Çünkü Kırım meselesini, Kırım Tatarların meselesi o kadar çok ki eğer de bunu sıra sıra konuşulacak olsa belki bir 3 saat bitirir.
I now would like to add a few words to what Mr. Wrzesnewski already said, and then I will gladly accept your questions. Why? Because the Crimean Tatar issue is so big, and I can talk for so long that it can take up to 3 hours. Therefore, it will be better if you ask your question and I'll answer them.
Kırım Yarımadası bildiğiniz gibi bütün Ukrayna toprağını yalnız %4'üdür ve nüfus olarak %5'idir. Ama orada geçen vakyalar o kadar önemli ki onun için Ukrayna basınında ve aslında Ukrayna'nın bağlı olan diğer memleketlerin basınında Kırım'ın yeri ayrı ve Kırım'a verilen o dikkat belki diğer Ukrayna'nın bölgelerine birkaçından daha fazladır.
As you might know, Crimea makes up just up to 4% of Ukraine's total area and up to 5% of its population. But the attention which is drawn to Crimea by both Ukrainian media and media of other countries is so significant that it surpasses the attention which is drawn to all other regions in total.
Bunun için birkaç sebep var. Birinciden bunun ayrıca etnik yapısıdır. Malum olduğu gibi 1944 yılında orasının Tamir halkı tamamıyla sürdürülecek soykırıma uğratıldı ve onların topraklarına yerine komşu memleketten Rusya'dan insanlar getirip vermiştir. Ve şimdi Kırım Yarımadası'nda resmi rakamlara göre %60'ı etnik Ruslar. Ama evet %20-25 kadar Ukraynalılar var derler ama onlar büyük çoğunluğu Ruslaşmış, yani milli kimliklerde kaybetmiş insanlar. Ayrıca burada duran %13 Kırım Tatarlarıdır.
And the reason for such uniqueness of Crimea is the ethnic composition of the region. As you know, in 1944, all the Crimean Tatars who were ethnically cleansed were deported from Crimea. After that, many Russians were brought from Russia to settle in the houses of the Crimean Tatars. Since then, now we have the following statistics which says that in Crimea there are around 60% of ethnic Russians, 20-25% of the Ukrainians, but you can guess that those Ukrainians have some problems with their identity, and like most of them, they unfortunately see themselves as the Russians. So, and you have 13% of the Crimean Tatars there.
Yapılan sosyolojik araştırmalara göre Kırım'da yaşayan Rus ve Rusça konuşan insanların %75'ten fazlası geleceğini Rus Federasyonu içerisinde görmektedir. Aslında biz elbette bu insanları pek yaşamıyoruz. Onlar Rusya'dan getirildi. Rusya'da onların akrabaları var. Onların medeniyeti, kültürü Rusya'nın bağlı. Elbette onlar kendi tarihi vatanlarına kayıt gitmeye hakları vardır. Ama burada problem şu ki, bu insanlar öz tarihi vatanlarına bizim tarihi vatanıyla beraber gitmek istiyor. Ama biz bunu elbette kesinlikle kabul edip olamayız.
There are some opinion polls which were held in Crimea, which state that around 75% of those Russians who live in Crimea see their future in Russia. And I can understand them. Why? Because they feel that Russia is their home, and they have a psychological sympathy to the country. But on the other hand, I do not understand why if you want to live at your home place with such a passion, you want our land to be brought within the borders of your country. If you want to live at your home place with such a passion, you are free to go. You are free to leave Crimea and stay in Russia, but not to take our land with you.
Ama Rusya tarafından bölücü kuvvetleri destekleyen büyük bir destek var. Arada sıra milletler arası kargaşalar yapılması için teşebbüsler yaptılar. Ve sonraki zamanlarda vaziyet daha ziyade gerginleşmeye başlandı. Çünkü iktidara gelen insanın, Cumhurbaşkanı, Kırım Yarımadası'nda büyük çoğunluğu besleyici işte bu şövenistik kuvvetlerden ve komünistlerden aldı.
Russia supports the separatist forces in Crimea, and all the initiatives which you might have heard about in Crimea, they are being held with the support of Moscow. And this is quite obvious, and we got used to it, but recently the situation in Crimea deteriorated. While the new authorities in Kiev are prone to influence of our neighbor.
İkinci çok bizlere rahatlayan mesele, ama ne içindir yüksek seviyede olan bizim rehberlerin, Cumhurbaşkanı'nın rahatlamayan şey, o bizim toprakta yerleştirilen Rusya'nın Karadeniz filosu.
The second issue of major concern for the Crimean Tatars, but for some reason not of concern for the current president, is the issue that a major chunk of Crimean land is owned and run by Sevastopol Black Sea Fleet.
Malum olduğu gibi 2008 Ağustos ayında Rusya ve Gürcistan savaş olduğu zaman Karadeniz filosu, Rusya'nın Karadeniz filosu Sevastopol'dan çıkıp Gürcistan'ın toprağına bombalar attı. Uluslararası anlaşmalara ve kaidelere göre, savaş kaidelerine göre Gürcistan'ın eğer bir isteği veya imkanı olsaydı, onlar karşılıklı bombaları bizim toprağımıza, yani Ukrayna toprağına, Kırım toprağına atmaya hakkı var. Yani böylelikle Rusya, bizge dost olan, bize komşu, bizimle ittifak olan Gürcistan arasında, Ukrayna ve Gürcistan arasında savaş açılmasına bir provokasyon gibi şey yaptı.
As you know, in 2008, during the war between Russia and Georgia, the Black Sea Fleet of Sevastopol sent a few warships to bombard the territory of Georgia. And if Georgia had a will and capability to fire back, due to international law, it would have such a right to come to Crimea and bombard the peninsula. And in such a way, we would be dragged into a war with our friends, actually, who we feel that they are our friends, by Russia.
Bildiğiniz gibi Gürcistan'a Rus toprağı askerleri girmezden önce bir propaganda vardı. Orada bildiler ki Rus vatandaşı olan Abhazları, yani Asetinlere baskı yapıyormuş Gürcistan tarafında ve Rus askerleri bu kendi Rus vatandaşların hak hukuklarını korçalamak için buraya girmiş gibi oldu. Yani önce bu insanlara Rus pasaportlarını dağıttılar ve ondan sonra onları korçalamak gibi o kendi askerlerini oraya getirdiler. Aynı şey Kırım'da da var. Çünkü bizim malumatlarımıza göre binlerce, on binlerce insanlara, orada yaşayan Ruslara, etnik Ruslara, Rus pasaportları verildi. Bu bizim Ukrayna kanunlarına aykırı. Çünkü Ukrayna kanunlarına göre orada bizde yaşayan insanlar tek bir pasaport sahibi olabilir. Ama Ukrayna kanunlarının zedeleyip böyle hareketler yapılmaktadır. Onun için eğer de Rusya'nın nasıl bir olaydığı zaman taptığı vakitte buna esaslanıp sanki orada yaşayan kendi vatandaşlarının haklarını koruyacak gibi oraya girişmeye, orada silahlı saldırı yapmaya imkanı olacak. Ve hem de burada mutlaka dışarıdan askerler getirmek değil de orada olan 23.000'den fazla olan Rus askeri artık Sevastopol'da yerleşmiştir.
One more interesting fact about the war between Russia and Georgia was that, and you might know it, that the Russians handed passports to those who lived in Abkhazia and Ossetia, before the war, and then it served for them as a very convenient excuse to step into the war, saying that we would like to protect our citizens, the citizens of Russia in Georgia. This is why we have to take an action. Now, the interesting thing about it is that in Crimea they've been doing precisely the same thing. They've been handing their passports. It is actually against the law of Ukraine, which explicitly prohibits dual citizenship in Ukraine, but despite this fact they've been doing this. So it will be no surprise if at one point they will want, or they will have a temptation to use this as an official excuse to do the same thing as they did in Georgia.
Ama bu gibi şeyler bizi çok rahatsızlamaktadır çünkü bu Kırım Yarımadası bu bizim toprağımızdır. Ve Harkip Anlaşması'na göre bu 2017 senesinde kaldırılacak Karadeniz filosu daha 20 yıl, 25 yıla uzatılması, daha 2045 yılına kadar uzatılması bize hayrete çıkardı. Yalnız bu insanlar, o anlaşmayı imzalayan insanlar yalnız kendileri için değil de bizim torunlarımız için bile karar aldılar.
And this is why we were surprised why the authorities made the Kharkiv agreements this year, which allowed the Sevastopol Black Sea Fleet, which was about to leave the place in 2017, to stay for 25 years more. We were infuriated by these agreements because it appeared that they made a decision not just for us, but which will also affect our children and grandchildren.
Daha bir mesele orada gerginlik sebebi olacak. Elbette Kırım Tatar meselesi. Yani Kırım Tatar meselesi, Kırım Tatarların hak hukukları verilmediği takdirde elbette orada devamlı gerginlik olacak ve devamlı provokasyonlar için zemin olacak.
One more issue which causes instability in the region is lack of resolution for the Crimean Tatar issue. As long as the Crimean Tatar issue is unresolved, there will be a fertile ground for speculations in the region which might lead to instability.
Biz çok yıllar devamında, Kravçuk zamanından başlayıp bugüne kadar Kırım Tatar halkının hak hukukları geri verilmesi konusunda kanun kabul edilmesini talep ediyoruz. Ama bugüne kadar maalesef neticelere ulaşıp olmadı. Ama aynı zamanda şunu da hatırlatmak istedim ki daha 1991 yılı Yeltsin zamanında Rusya tarafından, Rusya toprağından sürgün edilen insanların hak hukukları geri verilmesi hakkında kanun çoktan kabul edildi. Ama neden Ukrayna, daha ziyade demokratik olan Ukrayna'da bu kanun kabul edilmedi?
It is interesting that in Russia, in 1991, under then President Yeltsin, they adopted a law on rehabilitation of the rights of deported people, which regulated the status of all those who were deported. We in Ukraine, in independent Ukraine, we've been struggling to pass such a law for almost 20 years now, but it has been in vain. And we still have no such law which should regulate the status of the Crimean Tatar people and rehabilitate us in full.
Kırım Yarımadası'nın toprağında dini meselelerine gelince birkaç malumat vermek istedim. Oradaki yaşayanlar ve büyük çoğunluğu Pravoslav, yani Ortodoks kiliseli Moskova Patriarkatına tabi olan insanlar. Ve aynı zaman Kiev Patriarkatına tabi olan Hristiyanlar da var. Ama onlar azınlık. Şimdi evet %13 olarak vatanlarına kayıtlıklarla Müslümanlar. Dinler arası çatışmalar, yani gerginlikler yaratmak için de bazı güçler tarafından elbette çok provokatif çalışmalar yapılmaktadır.
One more issue that I want to share some insight with you is the religious issue in Crimea. You might have guessed that the majority of Crimeans are Christian Orthodox, which depends on Moscow Patriarchate. There are few who attend churches of Kiev Patriarchate, and there are 13% of local population who are Muslims as the Crimean Tatars.
Ukrayna kanunlarına göre elbette dinler aynı hakka sahip olmaları gerek ama pratik olarak öyle değil. Bir örnek getirmek istedim. Şimdi bu Moskova Patriarkatı'na ait olan kiliseler kurulmak için yüzlerce topraklar ayrılmış. Ama biz yalnız Akreçik'te bir cami, mevcut cami kurmak için 6 yıl devamında Kureyş'imiz hala da bugüne kadar bu müsaade bu toprağı alamadı. İkinciden, şimdi bunlar bütün dinleri birleştirmek için Mirdar, Boji diye bir teşkilat yaptılar. Orada kiliseler girmektedir. Ama aynı zaman Moskova Patriarkatı'nın diyorlar ki biz Ukrayna Pravoslav kiliseleri bu birleşmeyi irsetmeyeceksiniz. Çünkü bunlar tarikatçılar, bunlar gerçek Hristiyan değildir. Sen o zaman Hristiyan sayısında neden bunları Hristiyan saymasın? O zaman mecbur oldu protesto olarak bizim muftimiz de bu birleşmede çıkmaya.
Now, according to the law of Ukraine, all religions are same and have same like rights. But in reality, it is not so. In Crimea, there have been hundreds of Moscow-controlled churches being built with the permission and with the financial support of this state. But us, the Crimean Tatars, we've been struggling for over 6 years to get a single land plot in Simferopol to build a mosque for our own money, but we have not been successful in this. Now, one more thing is that recently there was a call from the Moscow Church to build an organization which would bring all the churches in Crimea onto one platform, which was called Peace Gift of the God, and all churches should have attended it. But then the Moscow Church said that we will not accept those churches which are controlled by Kiev Patriarchate. Why? Because those are not true Christians. They split the religion. They do not have the power to speak on behalf of somebody, and they would not let them in. And our Mufti, which is a religious leader of Crimean Muslims, in solidarity with Kiev Patriarchate, stepped out of the organization, saying that this is not a proper treatment of an equality of all churches.
Diğer bir örnek, mesela yakında birkaç yıl öncesi, bütün bizim köylerimizde, kasabalarımızda, şehirlerimizde girişinde de çıkışında Ortodoks kiliselere kaçları koyulmuştur. Biz diyoruz ki neden siz böyle şeyler yaparsınız? Çünkü bu köy kasabalarda yalnız Moskova demeleri ki Hristiyanlara, Pravoslav Hristiyanlara da değil, Müslümanlar da var, başkaları da var. Neden bunu yapıyorsunuz? Yok, bu böyle. Yani burada mesele yalnız din ihtiyaçları, insanların din ihtiyaçlarını karşılamak değil de mutlaka çeşit dinlere ait olan insanları birbirlerine getirmek. Hem de bunun başında duran Komünist Partisi'nin başkanı, aynı zamanda o zaman da o Kırım Yukarı Şurası'nın reisiydi, Lenin Graçin. Yani eski zamanlarda hem kiliseleri hem camileri yıkan insan, şimdi aşırı şekilde Hristiyan olduğu hep yerlerde kaçlar kurmaya başladı. Esas maksat, ben eminim ki emir başka yerlerden alınan din bakımından da insanların arasında böyle kargaşa yaratmak.
One more story which 2 years ago broke out in Crimea was that there was an initiative of Moscow Church to establish crosses at entrances of all villages and cities in Crimea. Now we asked them, why are you doing this? Because you can imagine that not just Christian of Moscow Church live in these places. You have Muslims here, Jews, and others. And but we had like no normal answer on that. And a funny side of this story was that the leader of this movement was Leonid Grach, who is a former communist leader of Crimean party. And it was so funny to see him being so passionate about this process, while a few years ago he was a convinced atheist.
Şimdi bu yeni Cumhurbaşkanı seçiminden sonra vaziyet ikinci deyişli en iyi tarafı değil. Kırım Yarımadası'nda bu seçimlerde Kırım Tatarları esas olarak milli demokratik kuvvetlere destekledi ve aslında Kiev'deki siyasetçilerin noktayı nazarına göre Kırım Tatarları Kırım içerisinde en esas, en tek bir Ukrayna'nın bütünlüğünü parçalayan bir toplum. Şimdi ise sonki Cumhurbaşkanı seçimlerinde Yanukovych'i destekleyen yeni de birinci olarak Rus bölücüler, komünistler oldu. Biz muhalefet olduk. Şimdi Kırım Tatarları öyle duruma geldi ki ne Kiev'den bir destek var ne elbette Kırım hakimiyet içerisinde bir destek var. Yani biz Ukrayna'nın bütünlüğünü parçaladıkmamıza rağmen öz vatanımızı yalnız olup kaldık.
Now with the new president being elected, the situation gets worse. Why? Because before we would be seen by Kiev as keen supporters of Ukrainian like territorial integrity and unity, and we would be supported by Kiev despite the resistance of local authorities in Crimea. Now when this authority came to power in Kiev, which was not supported by the Crimean Tatars, we did not vote for them. They were supported by the Russians and the communists who live in Crimea. We are not seen by them as their allies. To the contrast, they do not like us, if you can put it this way. And now we are in such condition that we are not being liked in Kiev. We, as usually, are not liked in Crimea, so we are on our own in Crimea.
Yani kısaca son olarak şunu söylemek istedim ki Kırım Yarımadası'nda durum çok rahatsız verici şekilde çok meseleler çözülme, eğer de bunların devam edecek olsa, nasıl bir destek, radikal bir şeyleri yapılmayacak olsa, orada o geçecek olaylar ne şekilde olacak, nasıl neticeleri verecek, elbette tahmin etmek mümkün. Onun için biz sonki geçirdiğimiz Kırım Tatar Milli Kurultayı'nda bir karara geldik. Kırım Tatar sorunu ve Kırım'daki durumu müzakere etmek için bütün dünya forumu topladı. Ve bu foruma çok dünyada belli olan siyasi adamları davet etmek, elbette Ukrayna'nın hakimiyeti, Ukrayna'nın yöneticilerini de oraya davet etmek ve böylelikle bir karara geldik. İşte bu çerçevede şimdi çalışmalar yapalım. Size sağ olsun Borys Bey. Biz ona Kırım'da her şeyi anlattık ve o bizi sağ olsun bizi buraya davet etti ve biz bu programımızı şimdi devam etmekteyiz.
So now when the situation in Crimea deteriorated, when the prospects are bleak, we as the Crimean Tatars, we realized that if no major action is taken to resolve the Crimean issue, then major bad things might happen in the region. So at the last session of the National Assembly of the Crimean Tatar people, of the Kurultay of Crimean Tatar people, we made a decision to call for an international conference on the Crimean Tatar issue, which will bring to Crimea famous and prominent politicians from all around the world to draw attention of the international community of the state of Ukraine to the Crimean Tatar issue, so that it is moved from that point. And we hope that this will be a success, and our visit here to Canada upon a very kind invitation of Mr. Wrzesnewski is done with the aim of drawing the attention of international community to this conference. We'd like to thank him very much for that.
Biz Sayın Borys Bey'in desteğinin onun yardımı olmasıyla bu görüşmeler olacak dedi. Biz Kanada Parlamentosu'nun en yüksek seviyesinde rehberlerini görüştük. Komite başkanlarıyla görüştük. Yine de Borys'in desteğinin o Ottawa'da olan birçok memleketlerin ilişkilerini bir araya getirip davamızı anlattık. Onların arasında Ukrayna Büyükelçisi Igor Ostaş vardı. İlginç tarafı şu ki biz bu konferansı konusunda söylediğimiz zaman Igor Ostaş %100 bu meseleyi destekleyip elbette böyle konferansı toplamak gerek olacak dedi. Söylemek istediğim elbette Ukrayna yönetiminde elçiler arasında olsun, hükümette olsun, parlamentoda olsun sağlam insanlar var ve biz o sağlam insanların desteğiyle öz meselelerimizi çözmeye çalışacağız.
And now, with the support of Mr. Wrzesnewski, we had a few meetings in Ottawa with top rank officials of Canada, including both the speakers, including chairs of parliamentary committees, a few more MPs. We met with the ambassadors of a few countries here. An interesting thing is that when we raised the issue of the conference and when we said that we have such an initiative, an ambassador of Ukraine to Canada, Igor Ostash, said that he will support and he fully supports the idea and the initiative, and that this is a really good thing to do, which means, as I said, that there are really different people in Ukraine, and there are those who think normally, those who are our friends. So we hope that with their support we will be successful and we will eventually succeed in Crimea.
Katılım için sağ olun. Sevgili sorularınız ise ben şunu söylemek istedim ya. Biz milli haklarımız için savaş verdiğimiz zaman, güreştiğimiz zaman bize çok insanlar, başka milletin insanları da destek verdiler. Çünkü bizim milli hareketimiz son derece demokratik. Ama hep bu insanların arasında en büyük destek veren bize yine de Ukraynalı, Ukrayna vatandaşlar, Ukrayna insanı General Petro Grigorenko'ydu. Biz şimdi Petro Grigorenko özümüzün halkımız gibi, özümüzün akrabamız gibi en sevilen insanlardan birisidir. Biz onun 100 yıllığına o zaman Düşşirka Cumhurbaşkanıydı, ona baskı yapıp onun 100 yıllığına bir para çıkarılmasına sebep oldu. O para 8.000 liraya çıktı. O 8.000 lira paranın 4.000 Kırım'da satıp aldılar. Birkaç yerlerini buraya getirdim, size onu da istiyorum.
I'll finish at this point. I'll gladly answer your questions, but before we start, I'd like to note the following, that we as the Crimean Tatars, we've been struggling within our national movement for many years, and because we are a democratic and non-violent movement, we have really many friends and supporters throughout the world. However, I'd like to note that our most beloved and our closest friends was and is the national movement of Ukraine. And so, for example, we had a very close friend of ours, Petro Grigorenko, the General Grigorenko, who we consider to be a member of our family, who did so much to raise the awareness of the world about the Crimean Tatar issue. And under Yushchenko's presidency, 2 hryvnia coins were published. And at the mint, minted. Sorry, minted, and there were 8,000 of them. Out of those 8,000, we, the Crimean Tatars, we bought out 4,000, so, because we really care about the memory of the general. And I brought some of them here, and I would like to hand them now to all of you who are here tonight. We just have around 40 coins there, so please donate it. Like, do understand if you do not get one.
So, first of all, Mr. Dzhemilev, thank you for sharing with us your thoughts. It's one thing to read about the challenges that you have been working towards, or working to resolve. It's another thing to hear them from you personally, so thank you very much. Before we move on, I know some of you have questions, but Mr. Dzhemilev has talked about a lot of complex issues, so I'm going to help by giving you a couple of moments to think about it. And in the interim, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce a couple of people, Mr. Oleg Romanishin and Borys from the League of Ukrainian Canadians. Mr. Dzhemilev, there are people in our community who have worked with you in the past, and Mr. Oleg Romanishin and Mr. Borys would like to present an honor to you in honor of some of that. Pan Romanishin, Pan Stetsky, proszę.
Very much, Ivan. Before we do the honors, I would like to say a few words about why we are doing this. As we all know, the Ukrainian Canadian community in the past has been very active in promoting national and human rights in the former Soviet Union, and also in the defense of political prisoners. And among those prisoners that we attempted to defend was Mr. Mustafa Dzhemilev. And since the League of Ukrainian Canadians was at the forefront of these activities, along with other Canadian organizations and groups, we are very honored and pleased to present this award to Mr. Dzhemilev and also make him an honorary member of the League of Ukrainian Canadians. I will read now the text. The text is, of course, in Ukrainian, and it reads: Нагорода за заслуги за довголітню боротьбу за національні і людські права кримськотатарського народу і вагомий внесок у державотворення незалежної і свободної України Мустафа Джемілєв отримує звання почесного члена Ліги українців Канади і нагороджується медаллю за заслуги імені Миколи Міхновського. One final word, Mikola Michnowsky is considered in history the father of the Ukrainian liberation movement in the 20th century. Thank you very much.
A knife or a hat. To bring here to Canada a horse was slightly difficult. To bring here a knife was in contradiction to our movement because we are non-violent. So therefore we resort to the third one. I'd like to present hats. This is a picture of Ваше Сарай. This is a picture of Ваше Сарай Hans Sarai, Hans Palace. and played with the national ornament of the Crimean Tatars.
I'd like to ask if anyone has any questions.
Sir, my question reflects that your stay in the Gulag of many years, 15 years, and I was wondering, you probably met a lot of Ukrainian prisoners in the Gulag, and did tell us how they related to the Crimean Tatars in that situation.
Sayılar zamanında bildiğiniz gibi siyasi mahpuslar iki maddenin cezalandırılacak. Birincisi 190. madde, bu Сланды, yani Crimean sovyetский строй. İkincisi de antisovyet propaganda, 70. madde. Bizleri büyük çoğunluğu 190. maddelere göre cezalandırılacak ve adli cinayetçilerle, yani uygulamalıklarla beraber tutanaklar. Elbette siyasi bu 190. maddeye göre kapanan insanları bu uygulamalıklar arasında tutanaklar ve kırışa ediler bir lagerde ne kadar mümkün olduğu kadar siyasi mahpuslar beraber olsun. Ama buna bakmadan elbette bazı zaman karşılaştık şöyle. En yakın ama beraber değil dedik. Ondan sürgünlükte Yakutistan'da olduğumuz zaman o zaman Vyacheslav Chernovil'de Yakutistan'da aramızda büyük mesafe var idi. Ama orada mektupleşmeye imkan vardı. Onun için çok mektupleşirdik. Son Boryn verilen de mektupleşirdik. Yosif Zizil'le mektupleşirdik. Şimdiki bu Ukrayna insan hakları için mücadele edildiğini. Lipkoluk, yanından konumda böyle var buraya.
Now, at the time of Soviet Union, there were two articles upon which they would convict the political activists. One is article number 190, which was about slander against Soviet regime, and then the other one was article number 70, which mentioned the anti-Soviet propaganda. Most of us were convicted and sentenced upon the first one, and we would be put and placed with regular criminals in prisons, because the Soviets would try not to have too many political prisoners serving their sentences in a single, in a common place. But despite this fact, we would have communication with other political prisoners. As for the Ukrainians, when I was serving my sentence, one of them in Yakutia, I was quite close to Vyacheslav Chernovil. Even though we had quite a distance between us, we had a chance to exchange letters, so that we kept in touch. Other than him, I was in touch with Borys brothers, with Yosif Zisils, with other prominent Ukrainian activists like Levko Lukyanenko and others.
Değişik bir şey, Vyacheslav Chernovil'in Yakutistan'da çok mektupleşiyorduk ki, o bana bir mektup yazdı. Dedi ki, sizin Sovyetlere karşı verdiğiniz taleplerde böyle sözler yazıyor. Требуем восстановить статус pro депортации. Yani deportasyadan olan evvel statüsü geri vermenize talep ettiğimiz hep yazısı olur. Ama deportasyadan önce Kırım Yarımadası Rusya Federasyonu'ndaydı. Eğer böyle talep edecek olsanız, gerekçesi yine de Kırım'da Rus Federasyonu'nda olmasını istiyor. Ama benim fikrimce dedi sizin geleceğiniz Ukrayna çerçevesinde daha iyi olacak. Ben de ona şaka olarak yazdım ki dedim, bizim tarihlerimiz daha uzakta gitti. Onun için galiba dedim, bağımsız Ukrayna devleti hapishanelerinde de yatmaya sıra gelecektir diye şaka olarak cevap verdim de ona. Sonra Çernobil bana dedi ki yok öyle şey olmayacak. Demokratik Ukrayna'da Kırım Tatarları ne istesinler, nasıl statü istesinler öyle olacak dedi. Bana cevap veriyorum.
We had quite a few letters exchanged between me and Vyacheslav Chernovil, and we had many topics of discussion there. One of those was about the claim, the demand of the Crimean people to come back to Crimea and to restore the national autonomy which we had before the deportation there. And one of his letters, Mr. Chernovil said that, why are you asking for restoration of an autonomy that you had before the deportation? Because it will mean that Crimea will be handed back to Russia. Why don't you think of Crimea in terms of its integral part of Ukraine and look into the future? I answered him saying that, well, do you mean that in some time in future we will be serving our sentences in prisons of Ukraine, like with the Crimean Tatars? And Chernobyl said, no, not. Why? Because we see Ukraine as an independent and very democratic state, so your rights will be respected there.
Thank you very much. Actually, listening to you, I think that you are talking about the same conflict which happened 20 years ago in Europe, in Bosnia and Herzegovina particularly. And what is the parallel between those conflicts? And how is it possible that Europe tolerating those conflicts, similar conflicts, all over there, and or maybe they want to tolerate those conflicts?
Siz burada paralel getirmeye mümkün değil çünkü farklar, vaziyet bambaşka. Bunlar şimdi yakın zamanlarda olup geçen olaylar, bu Kosova'daki olayların dağı, Rusya basınında ve Ukrayna basınında da çok böyle makaleler çıktı. Dediler ki işte paralel getirmeye çalıştılar orada. Dediler işte böyle tehlike Kırım'da da var. Kırım Tatarları da Kosova'daki olduğu gibi kendi bağımsız devlet kurmayı isterler diye. Ama bu gibi propaganda esas olarak Rusya'dan. Etmek istediğim elbette paralel yok ama buna benzer problem Kırım'da da var. Ve bu problem gerginleşmemesi için uluslararası burada girişmesi şart değil. Yeter ki devlet, Ukrayna devleti gerekli adımlar yapsın.
I don't really think that the two situations are similar. Why? Because the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina was a bit different. And for example, most recent example was about Kosovo. When things happened there, there were many speculations that in Crimea we would have a similar scenario. And mostly these rumors were coming from Moscow, because they wanted to stir things up and to fuel some feelings in Crimea. What I'd like to say is that probably in Ukraine and in Crimea the situation is different. Why? Because I do not think that there should be an intervention of international forces to resolve the issue. In Crimea, in case of Crimea, it will be enough for the state, for the Ukrainian government to take an action and to resolve this issue from inside. It will be enough, it will suffice.
Boris
mentioned in his introduction that he noticed that certain regional authorities were outright racist or hostile toward the Crimean Tatar population. I'm more curious about the neighbors that you live with. Could you tell us, in view of the fact that in the West there is a growing xenophobia towards Muslims since 9/11, I'm curious, what are the day-to-day relations between communities in Crimea, and there are a number of them, and the Crimean Tatar population? Which groups do you have warm and cordial relations with, and which ones are outrightly hostile?
Şunu söylemek istiyorum ki eğer de dışarıdan olsun, yani devlet içerisinde provokatörler, kışkırtmalar yapmasalar, artık sıradaki insanlar arasında barış mümkün. Nasıl da bir düşmanlık, çatışmalar için bir zemin yok. Mesela ben Kırım'a biz kayıtıp geldiğimiz zaman bizim komşumuz özür evin satmaya başladı, müşteri kıdırmaya başladı. Çünkü Kırım Tatar yanında oturacak, korku var insanın yüreğinde. Hem de Tatarların bir lideri gelmiş. Ama aylar geçti, şimdi bu komşu bize en yakın bir insan oldu. Çünkü yıllar devamında bunlar Kırım Tatarlara karşı o kadar iyi yarama propaganda kulağına sindirdiler. Gerçeği gördükten sonra insan değişti. İşte böyle değişmeler olmaması için hem Kırım'ın içerisinde bazı siyasetçiler ve en de önemlisi dışarıdan propaganda yapılmakta. Ben şunu da tekrarlamak istedim ki eğer de provokatif şeyler yapılmazsa insanlar birbirlerine anlaşabilir.
I'd like to say that I think that if there is no interference of foreign forces in Crimea, the situation will be fine there, and the people will live in peace there, and I see potential for that. For example, when I was coming back to Crimea to settle there, a neighbor of mine started selling his house. Why? Because he was so much afraid that Crimean Tatars were coming back, and he heard that the leader of the movement would be living nearby, so he was scared stiff. But then years passed, we've been living side by side, and now he is one of my very good friends there. And I think that these changes are possible. But the thing is that there are forces both in Crimea and political forces out of Crimea who are doing their best to prevent these changes happening. This is the problem. And I want to reiterate that if we do not have this influence, the people there will live in a peaceful and nice manner.
What the future holds for you people under the Yanukovych rule? What do you think?
Yanukovych'in birinci adımları böyle oldu. İlk kez bu seçimler geçtikten sonra onunla beraber bir Strasbourg'da konuştuk. Orada bir milletvekili, Estonya'dan bir milletvekili soru sordu. Dedi ki siz burada Rus dilin eşit dil yapmak için bir adımlar yapacak ekensiniz. Ruslara memnun yapacak, memnun edeceğim için bazı şeyler söylediniz. Ama Kırım Tatarların meselesi ne olacak? Bu meselede nasıl adımlar yapacaksınız diye böyle bir soru verdi. Onun cevabı böyleydi. Elbette ki sonraki yıllar devamında Kırım Tatar meselesinin çözülmesi için gerekli adımlar yapılmadı. Şimdi dedi ben Cumhurbaşkanı olduktan sonra gerekli adımlar yapacağım. Kırım Tatarları memnun edeceğim. Ve gerçekten de 2 haftadan sonra biz onu baş başa Yanukovych'le görüştük. Ben ona 40 dakika devamında meselemizi sıra ona söyledim. O dinledi beni, dedi biz bu meseleleri çözebiliriz de. Ama siz yani Kırım Tatarları benimle olması gerek, benim partimde olması gerek ve siz de bu benim koalisyonuma geçmeni istedim. Ben dedim evet siz Cumhurbaşkanısınız, biz size oylarımızı vermedik ama size halk büyük çoğunluk seçti. Elbette biz sizi Cumhurbaşkanı olarak tanıyacağız. Mesele eğer bizim bize uygun meselelerde sizinle işbirlik yapacağımız ama bazı prensiplerimiz var. Onun için sizin partinize girip olamayacağınız, sizin koalisyonunuza girip olamayacağınız, siz tayin etken birçok insanları biz destekleyip olamayacağınız, siz o imzaladığınız Karadeniz Pilonusu meselesinde anlaşmayı destekleyip olamayacağız. Ondan sonra Yanukovych pozisyonu değişti. O şimdi Kırım Tatarların arasında Kırım Tatarı seçilmiş olan gerçekten bir milleti temsil etken meclise karşı olan bir grupları bir araya getirip onların kendilerin kendi destekçileri olarak, kendi muhasebetleri olarak kullanmaya çalışıyor. Yani insan gerçekten de halkın temsil ettiği organının değil de halkımızı bölmeye çalışan adımlar yapmaktadır.
My first encounter with President Yanukovych was in Strasbourg, where he had his speech, his address to the Council of Europe there, and there was a question from a member of the Council from Estonia, who said the following: you've been talking so much about the Russians in Ukraine, about the status of the Russian language. However, can you please tell me what you are going to do on the Crimean Tatar issue? Yanukovych replying said that I know that there have been no measures taken on the Crimean Tatar issue recently by previous authorities. I promise that I will take action to satisfy the Crimean Tatar community in Crimea to meet their needs. Now, after that, we did meet indeed. And I went explaining him for over 40 minutes on the problems of the Crimean Tatars, giving him like pretty much full picture of what has been happening on the peninsula. He listened to me, and then answering, he said, well, we can do that. We can like satisfy your needs. But what you have to do instead is you have to join the coalition. You have to join my coalition in the parliament, and you have to support me. I said, well, we are honestly saying that we did not support you during the election. We did not vote for you. But we do recognize you as the president of Ukraine. And we will like, support your initiatives, which we think are good. But we do have some principles. We cannot support some of your decisions. For example, we cannot be happy with many of your appointees, both in Crimea and in Kiev, in the central government. We cannot be happy with the Black Sea Fleet agreements in Kharkiv. We cannot be happy with many other issues that you support. And so, like we said, no, we cannot join the coalition, unfortunately. He was not happy with the answer, and after that, what he did is that he organized a group of Crimean Tatar, of like representatives of the Crimean Tatar people, and instead of inviting to this group the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people, which is an elected body of the Crimean Tatar people, he invited there a few Crimean Tatars who are not recognized within the nations, and he made a group of puppets who support, who nod their hands on like whatever he says, But this is, of course, not a proper treatment and not a resolution of the Crimean Tatar issue.
I'm quite interested about the Crimean experience outside, or Crimean Tatar experience outside of Crimea. And my question is, how did to what extent was the Tatar community able to stick together in Central Asia, in places like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan? And to what extent did this experience, this burden of deportation, serve to either strengthen or weaken the sort of the national consciousness of the Crimean Tatar?
Karşısında bugün epeyce büyük diasporamız var. Elbette en büyük diaspora Türkiye'de bizim bazı tarihi araştırmalara göre Türkiye'de Kırım'da yaşayan Türk vatandaşların 10 derecede Türkiye'de yaşamakta. Ama onlar Türk vatandaşları, onların niyetleri yok. Fakat gezmeye yalnız böyle manevi destekler verilir. Ve büyük çoğunluğu aslında Kırım Tatar kimlikleri de oluşmuşlar. Çünkü Türkiye, Türk dili Kırım Tatarların dilinde bir farkı yok. Aynı dildeyiz. Orada ayrıntıcı o diskriminasyon ve şey yok. Onun için onlar tamamen Türk vatandaşı oldular. Yalnız bu kaç şehirlerde, büyük şehirlerde toplam 30'a yakın Kırım Tatar dernekleri var. Türkiye'de. Başka yerlerde diasporamız Rumanya'da var, Bulgaristan'da var, Amerika'da var, yardımcı olacağız. Kanada'da, Toronto'da ikimizin yakın Kırım'da var. Ve elbette eski seyahatler Türkiye'de Cumhuriyetlerinde, Rusya olarak Uzbekistan'da, Kazakhstan'da, Kırgızistan'da diasporalarımız var. En büyük Uzbekistan'da. Biz geçen sene 2009 Mayıs ayında bütün Dünya Kırım Tatar Kongresi'ni geçirdik ve onlara bir araya getirdik. 13 memleketten bizim temsilcilerimiz vardı ve şimdi elbette onları birleştirmeye biz teşebbüsler yapacaktık, çalışmalar yapacaktık. Bu sürgünlük gelişleşmemizi fayda getirdiğimiz vardır. Evet, sürgünlük yalnız esas olarak zararı oldu. Çünkü insanlarımız daha ziyade dağılmasına sebep oldu. Ama aynı zamanda elbette milletin başına gelen devlet insanları yakınlaştırdı. Bu bakımdan özellikle bir yakınlaşma var.
Now, the largest diaspora of the Crimean Tatar people resides in Turkey. Actually, their number is 10 times the number of the Crimean Tatars who live in Crimea. But an interesting thing about them is that they are not interested in coming and settling in Crimea. Their involvement into Crimea is rather about like providing moral support to the Crimean Tatar people. Why? Because they, for many decades that they've been there, they have lost their national identity, and because they are treated fairly well in Turkey, and so they feel more like Turks, though they do recognize that they are of Crimean Tatar background. What they do is that they support like culture of the Crimean Tatars. They support language that they speak. And for these reasons and for these purposes, they have around 30 organizations there in Turkey, which like constitutes quite a network. Other than that, we have significant diasporas in Romania, in Bulgaria, in the US. We're going there tomorrow actually to meet them. In Canada, a few hundreds of people. In terms of former Soviet Union, yes, in Uzbekistan we have a really big one, and in other countries as well. Now, for the reason of bringing all the Crimean Tatars together, last year we called for a World Congress of the Crimean Tatar people, which was held for the first time in Crimea. We had representatives from 23 countries of the world. It has been a success. Now, on your question of the impact of deportation on the Crimean Tatars, of course, predominantly the impact is negative. Why? Because now the Crimean Tatars are scattered all around the world. Of course, there's been a positive side effect of it, which is that the tragedy did unite the people to some extent, so that they are conscious of their identity now.
I just want to pick up on your conversation with Mr. Dzhemilev. In your view, is the Crimean Tatar problem a human rights issue that can be solved by strengthening human rights, or is it a political issue that requires a political solution? And if it's a political issue, what is the political solution?
Evet, insan hakları meselesi ve aynı zamanda milli mesele. Bizim yalnız şahsların haklarını yerine getirmek değil mi? Politik haklarımız var. Mesela benim evet, ana dilimde eğitim almaya, okumaya hakkım var. Bir kimse yasak etmiyor. Var, kurulduğunu yaptı, çağrıklarını da okur. Ama öyle olmuyor. Bu kolektif hakların çözülmesi için devlet tarafından gerekli tedbirler alınması gerekiyor. Onun için bu yalnız insan hakları meselesi değil, ve aynı zamanda milli mesele demek mümkün. Şimdi nasıl çözüm olması lazım? Bizim taleplerimiz Kırım Yarımadası'nda sürgünlükten evvel olduğu gibi milli muhtar cumhuriyeti olması için. Şimdiki program milli muhtar cumhuriyeti değil de aslında temelinde Rus cumhuriyeti oldu. Biz isteyiz ki bu cumhuriyet milli muhtar cumhuriyeti olsun. Ve onun esas elementi mutlaka orada Kırım Abdülhamid Cumhuriyeti'nde resmi dillerden birisi Ukrayna dilleriyle beraber Kırım Tatar dili olması gerekiyor. Ve Kırım Tatar halkının temsilcileri hiç olmadıkça sayılarına göre bu cumhuriyette olması gerekiyor. Ve madem ki bu toprak Kırım Tatarların ana vatanıdır, onların milli varlıkların, milli kültürünün, milli tarihinin canlandırması için devlet tarafından tedbirler alınması gerekiyor. İşte Çernobil ve onun partisi bizim için en yakın ve biz hep seçimlerde Ruh Partisi'nin beraber olamaz. Çünkü tek Ruh Partisi'nin programında Kırım Tatar meselesi ifade edilmiş ve onların fikrince Kırım meselesi çözümü bizim fikrimizden farklı değil. O sebeple biz Çernobil'e gerçekten de çok yakın arkadaşıydık ve şimdi de bizim bağlantılarımız esas olarak Ruh Partisi ve buna benzer milli demokratik yönlerine beraber.
On a question, the human rights are split in two, the individual human rights and collective human rights. When we talk about Crimea, we mean both. So that some human rights can be exercised in an individual manner, so that you do not need others to be happy with them. On the other hand, you have collective human rights, like right for language, so that if you are on your own in like setting a school and like studying yourself, it does not make much sense. There has to be a collective recognition of a nation which is there, so that a state takes an action to satisfy both the individual and the collective rights of the Crimean Tatar people. Now, more specifically on the solution. We see Crimea in the future as a national autonomy of the Crimean Tatar people. How will that occur in the framework of Ukraine? How will that work is that we have to have our language as an official language of the autonomy, along with the Ukrainian language as a state language of Ukraine. We have to have a guaranteed representation of the Crimean Tatars in local authorities, at least at the level of our population composition in Crimea. As like you mentioned, Mr. Dzhemilev, you said that on this question, I'd like to say that he really understood us well, and his party, which is People's Movement of Ukraine, is the only party in Ukraine which has in its program a clause which stipulates the Crimean Tatar issue. And the thing is that the view of the party on the Crimean Tatar issue is the same as we view it. So that it is said that the Crimean Tatars shall have their national autonomy in Crimea. We have been keen supporters of the party throughout the independence of Ukraine, and we have always been together at the election, as well as we always support all other democratic forces in Ukraine during the elections.
Last question? Yes, sir.
Ben kendi dilimden soracağım. Ben Türkiye Polatlıkların Tatar Derneği Başkanıyım. Mustafa Dzhemilev Arama, efsanevi liderimiz Mustafa Dzhemilev bizi demokratik Kanada'da temsil ettiği için ve Kırım Türklerinin sorunlarını çok güzel bir yere getirdiği için kendisine şükranlarımı sunuyorum. Kırım Türklerinin bütün sorunlarını aşağı yukarı anlattı. Yalnız eksik kalan bir şey oldu. 1967 tarihli kararname ile Kırım Türklerinin Kırım'a dönüşleri serbest bırakıldığı halde bugün hala Özbekistan ve diğer sürgün yerlerinde Kırım'a dönemeyen soydaşlarımızın sorunu şu anda ne durumda onu sormak istiyorum. Kendisine saygılar sunuyorum.
The question was from a gentleman who is a leader of Turkish Crimean Tatar community of Canada, and he thanked Mr. Dzhemilev for his presentation, saying that he covered pretty much all the issues of the Crimean Tatars. His question was about those who are still in Uzbekistan and other regions of former Soviet Union, saying that since 1967, when a decree of Soviet Parliament came out saying that the Crimean Tatars are free to settle wherever they want in Soviet Union, there has been, we still have many thousands of the Crimean Tatars living there, in those places of deportation. So the question was, when do we foresee them coming back to Crimea, and how will that happen?
Sağ olun. 1967 senesi kararı, devlet o karara göre def kurulları istediği yerlerde devlet bu bakımdan Kırım içerisinde de yaşamaya hakkı var. Ama hepimiz biliriz ki bu sahte kararıydı. Çünkü aynı bu kararın üzerinde gizli kararlar geldi Kırım'a ve Kırım'a kayıtıp gelen diktatörlerini yeniden sürgün etti. Şimdi mesele o Kırım'ın dışarısında kalan insanlarımızı nasıl getireceğiz öz vatanına. Büyük mesele. Elbette bunun çözümü devletsiz, devletin desteği olmayınca imkansız demek mümkün. Çünkü insan orada Özbekistan'da, Kazakistan'da yaşayan insan hep eşyalarını, evlerini satıp kayıtıp gelse bile yalnız orada yol parasını çıkarır. Ama Kırım'a gelip de sıfırdan başlamaya işi olmayıp, evi olmayıp yaşap, elbette yerleşip olamayacak. Onun için şimdi dışarıdan gelen Kırım Tatarların sayıları pek az. Ama onları çoğaltmak için onların vatanına getirmek için devlet tarafından desteklenir ve biz bu meseleye devamlı Ukrayna devletinin önüne koyarız ve koymaya da devam edeceğiz. Ama aynı zamanda elbette dışarı kaynakları da aramak gerek olur. Yalnız biz Ukrayna'dan bekleyecek olsak ve o oradan da bu çözümü almasak ebediyen vatandaşlarımız orada kalacaktır. Onun için şimdi bizim çalışmalarımız da bu meseleye yalnız Ukrayna devleti değil de bütün dünya kamuoyunun başka memleketlerini de dikkatli çekmektir.
The degree that you mentioned, you know that it was a nominal one. It has never been put into force. Why? Because in reality, local authorities in Crimea at that time, in 1967, were instructed to force the Crimean Tatars back, not to allow them to come back to Crimea. Now, we are confident that unless we have a state-level like robust resolution of the Crimean Tatar issue, those who live in Uzbekistan and in Kyrgyzstan now, they will have very limited chance to come back to Crimea. Why? Because if he or she now sells all his property, he will make money just for his travel, and he will not be able to buy a house in Crimea to find a job and start there. Therefore, we have been having very, very low figures of the Crimean Tatars coming back to Crimea in recent years. So we do believe that unless we have a robust, a good decision on the state level, this will not have a major move in a positive direction. Other than that, we believe that in this case, we can reach out to the international community for support, and not just waiting for the Ukrainian state to take an action. And we are doing that. We ask the international funds, some charity organizations, to be more keen on supporting the Crimean Tatars in their repatriation to Crimea. Hopefully, this will work.
I guess we hadn't noticed, but I'd also like to welcome leading figures from the Bosnian Canadian community who joined us here this evening. And in fact, it's a community that well knows what are the consequences when things go wrong. And I had the very difficult role of having to be at commemorative events for a number of years for Srebrenica and the genocide that occurred there. And we certainly hope that never again will we see that sort or that type of violence committed against peoples in Europe or anywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, this community has had the honor, good fortune of hosting leading figures in the struggle for human rights. Late Vyacheslav Chernogil, Leopold Lukyanenko, the Borys brothers, and tonight we've had the honor of hosting Mr. Mustafa Dzhemilev. His personal, harrowing story, and that of the Crimean Tatars, is in fact the story of the triumph of the human spirit over unimaginable evil. And I'd like to thank Mr. Dzhemilev for sharing with us his vision of human justice, human dignity, rights, of nonviolence, and its consequent peace, stability for the Crimean Peninsula, stability and integrity of the Ukrainian state, and democracy, and consequent prosperity for the region. Thank you so much. final presentation this evening, and it's from a very good and long-time friend of mine, a political mentor, gentleman politician, Mr. Dzhemilev.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for choosing this venue, Parkdale High Park. As you just said, many, many leaders, many artists from all over the world have met here for the 14 years when I was member of Parliament. But today, I'm a member of the Canadian Association of former parliamentarians, together with your Shimko and Vita like that. But Mr. Dzhemilev, Boris said in Ottawa, you got a standing ovation. I know what that feeling is like. But on behalf of the Canadian Association of Former Parliamentarians who've been working with Ukraine over so many years, I too welcome you to Canada from the bottom of all our hearts. And another hat that I wear is I'm director of the Atlantic Council of Canada. And Ukrainians are so generous. When we visit Ukraine, I've been there 4 times. I can never leave without getting something to take back to Canada. So I'd like you to take back to Ukraine something that I am wearing tonight. It's the Atlantic Council of Canada tie. Every country that's a member of NATO will have its own tie. So France will have Atlantic Council of France. You'll have the NATO logo and the French flag. U.S. will have the NATO logo and the U.S. flag. My dream for what you're fighting for is that someday Ukraine will have a tie like this with NATO logo and the Ukrainian flag.
Thank you, everyone.